they did not believe that Jesus died for sins. In fact, Jesus himself didn't believe it. And as I said, the author of the Gospel of Luke and the...
Welcome, everyone, to today's intense and compelling debate. In this exciting exchange, we will be witnessing a heated and intellectually charged discussion titled, Shamoun Annihilates PhD Muslim Scholar for 10 minutes straight. On one side, we have Shamoun, a prominent Christian apologist and scholar, known for his sharp arguments and his commitment to defending the truth of Christianity. On the other side, we have Muslim Man's Name, a PhD Muslim scholar, who is well versed in Islamic theology and has dedicated his life to studying the Quran and Islamic doctrine. Let's dive into this debate.
How do you explain that the earliest Christian texts, including the epistles, clearly say that Jesus is the Son of God who died for our sins? That's number one. Number two, what is the Injil, the good news? What exactly did Jesus promise?
So maybe the earliest extant Christian texts do teach that. I think Paul did teach that, and some of the epistles do. But the early Jewish Christians, led by James, the brother of Jesus, they did not believe that Jesus died for sins. In fact, Jesus himself didn't believe it. And as I said, the author of the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts, he doesn't believe that Jesus died for sins. And one other corroboration of that is the early Jewish Christians, after the resurrection of Jesus, they continued to practice the Torah. They continued to go to the temple and offer sacrifices there. But if Jesus' death was an atoning sacrifice for sins, why would the early Jewish Christians, after Jesus' resurrection, continue the Torah and continue temple sacrifice to the point they even forced Paul to perform a Nazirite sacrifice? So there's an inconsistency. As for the term Jesus is the Son and God, I don't have time to discuss it here, but I would dispute that the Gospels actually teach that Jesus is God.
Now notice, ironically, he quotes Luke, who wrote Acts, to tell you that the Jews continued to observe temple sacrifices, but that's the same Luke and Acts that present Jesus and his followers as affirming the divine sonship of Jesus Christ. So he wants his cake and eat it too. And secondly, you just argued from silence. To say that Luke did not mention the atonement is not the same as saying he denied the atonement. As an academic, you don't want to make these leaps in logic because that's a logical fallacy. And thirdly, you're wrong. In Luke 22:19-20 and Acts 20:28, there we're told that Jesus will shed his blood for the new covenant, which is for the forgiveness of sins. So stop parroting Bart Ehrman, who's been refuted, and stay current with current scholarship. So you're wrong. And if it is corrupted, the Quran is wrong because it's telling Christians to judge by that gospel. The only gospel they had is the New Testament, which means, again, the Quran is wrong and Muhammad is a false prophet. Can't have your cake and eat it too. I'm sorry, Indani.
Who wrote the Injil?
Well, originally...
Take as much time as you want.
Yeah, so the Injil is the teaching of Jesus, and from a historical perspective, that's literally the name of what he taught. And we know for about a century or so, according to modern scholarship, the early Christians had a more oral conception of Jesus' teaching. So Jesus' teachings were passed on orally. That's what Q basically is, right? And then at some later point, the Jesus tradition is sort of written down, and these Jesus sayings are sort of transmitted in writing at some point, and then the anonymous gospel authors, they pick up these Jesus sayings and they have a narrative that they'd heard orally and they put it in writing. So the Injil, from a historical perspective and even from a Quranic perspective, it is an oral revelation. It's not a physical book.
Guys, do you see the circle of reasoning again? How do you know that Jesus preached the gospel and what it is? Oh, because of the gospels, which are corrupt and unreliable and anonymous. So you trust the gospels to tell you that Jesus preached the gospel, but when the gospels then tell you that Jesus also made statements, or they make statements about Jesus that show Muhammad was a false prophet, oh, that's where it's corrupt. Moreover, how does he know about Q? Q is extrapolated from the material found in Matthew and Luke. So if Matthew and Luke are reliable enough to give you Q, then why are they unreliable in other areas where they show that Jesus proclaims his sacrificial death, his divine sonship? And moreover, there's a saying in Q, Matthew 11:27, Luke 10:22, where Jesus says, all things have been handed to me by my Father. No one knows who the Father is except the Son, and no one knows who the Son is except the Father, and to whom the Son reveals him. That saying from Q, which predates the Gospels, shows that Islam is false and Muhammad is a false prophet. Can't have your cake and eat it too, Andani.
For Khalil, why hold Q, the Quran, I suppose, is not affirming the New Testament? What if the Quran author was mistaken, thinking the New Testament was given to Jesus? Seems to assume divine authorship.
So again, if the Islamic dilemma is an internal critique, which I said at the beginning that it is an internal critique and it's only presented to believing Muslims, then a Muslim can assume the Quran is from God, and they can simply say, okay, how does the Quran define the Injil? But frankly, even if we put that aside, you can do an academic investigation of how does the Quran define the Injil, and you don't end up with the New Testament. So I don't even have to assume divine authorship for what is the Quranic conception of the Injil, just like a lot of scholars ask, what is the Quranic concept of kitab? And Daniel Madigan he applies a principle of charity. He's a Catholic priest. He says, look, if we want to know what kitab means in the Quran, we should read the Quran holistically. We shouldn't just assume the Quran is a disjointed, incoherent text. You only would conclude that a text is incoherent if all the possibilities of a coherent reading are impossible or completely nullified. But in the case of the Injil, we have a coherent notion of what the Injil is in the Quran, and it doesn't comport with any definition of the New Testament, which Sam still has to prove. It's been about 3 hours. I'm still waiting for the Quranic mention of the 27 books of the New Testament.
And I'm still waiting for you to show me the Quran, where the Quran says how many surahs make up the Quran and how many verses make up each surah of the Quran. It's not in the Quran. Therefore, if you're going to follow that criteria, how do you know what the Quran is? The Quran doesn't tell you. Stop arguing from silence. That's a bad way of responding and refuting and proving your case. Moreover, I did more than that. I showed you the Quran says whatever revelation they had, that is the uncorrupt revelations of God. And they had the New Testament, whether you like it or not. Even you admit that the Quran is aware of the New Testament, interacts with it. Again, it's like you want to have your cake and eat it too. And finally, it's irrelevant what modern 21st century academic scholarship says. Unless you think the Quran is irrelevant, it wasn't meant for that time period. It was only meant for you scholars today. So if that's the case, the Quran was revealed in the wrong time period. Allah should have sent it down in the 21st century for you scholars. You have to answer what it means in its historical context. And I've given you context within the Quran and outside sources, and your case has been soundly refuted. There is a dilemma. The Quran confirms the Bible and yet denies its core doctrines, which means Muhammad's a false prophet. Come home to Jesus, and then he's waiting.
For Khalil, Reynolds argues the Quran didn't possess knowledge to know this difference, how Jews, Christians, and the Quran author envisage these scriptures. What is your opinion? Khalil, are you back? Can you hear us?
Yeah, it just sometimes this happens. So I got kicked out. Sam's argument was too powerful. It booted me out of the room.
Oh!
So I've shown you in my slideshow that based on the scholarship we have, and Sam, the reason why I cite scholarship is you just said in your prior comment before I got booted, you have to read the Quran in its historical context. Yeah, I agree. That's what scholarship does. That's what the whole field of Quranic studies does. Just like biblical studies reads the Bible in its historical context. So the scholarship that reads the Quran in its historical context has concluded that the Quran is quite familiar with some very fine details within the Bible, within the Old Testament and New Testament. So based on, say, the findings of Imran al-Badawi, which shows the Quran interacts with the Gospels, even at a textual level, I think the author of the Quran does know what Jews and Christians think about their scriptures, and it knows to the extent where the Quran can correctly identify that their scriptures that they have are a mix of, man-made revelation and actual revelation. And this is a conclusion that modern scholarship only until recently corroborated when it tells us that Moses didn't really write the Pentateuch, right? Jesus didn't actually say everything that is attributed to Jesus in the New Testament. The Quran was already saying this in a religious context of 1400 years ago, and now modern scholarship, much of whom is by Christians, is saying the same thing. So contrary to the Islamic dilemma, a lot of modern scholarship is a confirmation of certain Quranic critiques of the scriptural corpus of Jews and Christians. And I think the reason why Sam doesn't like to cite scholarship is because most of the scholarship would go against his own beliefs.
Now, I noticed that he wants to respond to my response. We can do this all day, but I'm going to address what you just said. Contrary to what you just asserted, I also appeal to modern scholarship, but I don't swear by them because they're not my prophets or my messengers or my rightly guided imams. They can be mistaken. So, no, I have quoted scholars, but at the same time, you have to go to the Quran itself. And if you want to now know how the Quran was understood historically, you don't start with 21st century scholarship. You have to see how the Quran is being defined and explained and see if there's a consensus or they're all over the map. So, again, I don't deny the importance of scholarship, but you swear by scholarship and you live by it. It's like they are your rightly guided imams. But more than that, you keep saying that Moses didn't write the bulk of the Pentateuch because he wrote in the third person. Well, that means Allah did not inspire the Quran because Allah speaks of himself in the third person. That means Jesus could not have uttered the words attributed to him in the Gospels because he speaks of himself in the third person. See, this is what happens when you blindly follow scholarship and not see how people spoke and wrote in their historical context.
The topic is the Islamic dilemma, not the Christian dilemma. Stop being up the 27 books and stick to the topic.
The reason why I have to bring it up is because premise 1 of the Islamic dilemma says the Quran confirms the divine inspiration, authority, and preservation of the New Testament. Now, the New Testament is a library of 27 books that were canonized in the 4th century, over 300 years after Jesus. So my solution to the Islamic dilemma is to attack premise 1. And that's basically what I do. I show that there's no positive case in the Quran that affirms premise 1. basically. And then what the Quran does affirm, which is just the gospel of Jesus, that definition or concept of gospel doesn't match a 27-book canon. So I didn't call that premise one refutation the Christian dilemma. I just refer to the fact that the burden of proof is on the Christian to show that the Quran affirms a 27-book New Testament canon, which it clearly does not. Once that premise is destroyed, the Islamic dilemma basically collapses onto itself. And the thing is that a Christian like Sam has no way of even validating the 27-book canon as being from God except by appealing to circularity. Sam has to say that the 27 books are true revelation because the church said it. But then if I ask him to prove the authority of the Roman Catholic Church, he's going to have to appeal to arguments out of the 27 books. So he has to presuppose the 27 books are from God. So that then leads to a sort of a Christian circularity dilemma. But that's not what I was arguing during the presentation.
No, actually, I'll appeal to the Quran if I'm speaking to a Muslim, because according to chapter 3, verse 55, 61:14, if you believe the Quran is divine and you believe Allah cannot lie, he swore that the followers of Jesus would be victorious, and he gave them victory, and they dominated over the unbelievers, and he'd empower them to be victorious till the day of resurrection. So if the Quran is true, then the true church prevailed, and the true church looks nothing like Islam, because the true church held to the 27 books of the New Testament and the books of the Old Testament and affirmed the Trinity. And you actually proved my case. Guys, I want you to keep hearing what he says. It wasn't until the 4th century the New Testament canon was finalized. Well, by the time Muhammad, that means they knew what the canon was. And since Muhammad is appealing to his contemporaries, not to the 4th century, his contemporaries would know when he says, you are to uphold the Torah and the gospel, all the revelation given to you, means that you uphold your New Testament, because that's God's word. But if we do that, Muhammad is a false prophet and antichrist. And I'm not saying to disrespect, I'm just saying theologically, and he has to go. That's why the Islamic dilemma. So thank you for making my case again. I'll just use your Quran to make my case that's effectable. Now they observe these sacrifices with the proper attitude. These sacrifices do not take away sin. They provided a temporary covering, but they were a shadow of something greater, Jesus Christ. So we observe them not because they take away our sin, but to show our thankfulness and fidelity to the law that God gave Moses, and use that as a stepping stone to tell the Jews these sacrifices, the fact that you're repeating them shows they don't do the job of removing your sin, right? Yeah, because they're pointing someone greater who does. Who? Jesus Christ. So it showed fidelity to the God of Moses, that it's the same God revealed in Christ, and also using that as an opportunity to point people to Christ. Hey, what do you think these sacrifices point to? The suffering servant of Isaiah 53. So where's the problem?
The speaker contends that early Jewish Christians, led by James, and even Jesus himself, did not teach the doctrines that Paul later emphasized, example, atonement for sin. They point out that these early Christians continued practicing Torah laws and temple sacrifices, implying they did not see Jesus' death as an atoning sacrifice. The Injil is viewed as the oral teachings of Jesus, not the written New Testament canon. This perspective aligns with modern scholarship, which sees the Gospels as later compilations of oral traditions rather than direct divine revelation. The Muslim speaker asserts that the Quran does not affirm the New Testament's 27-book canon but instead refers to the Gospel of Jesus, which does not match the Christian New Testament. They argue this undermines the dilemma since the Quran neither confirms nor denies the later Christian canon. The speaker highlights a circularity dilemma, accusing Christians of validating the Bible's authority through the Church and the Church's authority through the Bible. Some points to Quranic verses, example 355 and 6:114, to argue that the Quran affirms the divine inspiration, authority, and preservation of the scriptures available at Muhammad's time, which included the New Testament canon. He emphasizes that if the Quran is correct, the true church and its scriptures, including the 27-book New Testament, must have prevailed. While acknowledging the value of modern scholarship, some criticizes the Muslim speaker's reliance on it as the ultimate authority, noting that scholarship is fallible and often based on assumptions rather than definitive conclusions. He challenges the argument that Moses and Jesus could not have said or written certain things based on stylistic preferences, such as speaking in the third person. Some refute the claim that Luke Acts denies Jesus' atonement by citing passages like Luke 22 verses 19 to 20 and Acts 20 verse 28, where Jesus' sacrificial death is clearly mentioned. He accuses the Muslim speaker of cherry-picking from Luke Acts to support their arguments while ignoring contradictory evidence. Some assert that the Quran's claim to confirm previous scriptures creates a problem if those scriptures, for example, the New Testament, contradict Islam's core teachings. He argues this contradiction undermines the Quran's divine authorship and challenges Muslims to reconcile the Quran's affirmation of the Bible with its clear doctrinal differences. The Muslim speaker's reliance on historical critical methods aligns with modern academic approaches but poses a challenge when engaging with traditionalist views that demand direct Quranic evidence. Sam's rebuttal that the Quran affirms the scriptures known in Muhammad's time, implying the New Testament canon, is a direct appeal to Quranic authority, countering the Muslim speaker's reliance on external scholarship. The Muslim argument hinges on defining the Injil as oral teachings of Jesus, which they argue diverges from the written New Testament canon. Sam's counter is effective in exposing the inconsistency. If the Quran acknowledges Jesus preached the gospel, then rejecting the New Testament as a representation of that gospel becomes problematic. The Muslim speaker's critique of secular reasoning in Christian theology is a common objection, but Sam skillfully redirects this by challenging the Muslim speaker to apply the same scrutiny to the Quran and Islamic tradition. Sam's ability to frame the Quran as confirming the Bible strengthens the dilemma's force. However, the Muslim speaker's strategy to redefine the Injil undermines this premise. The crux of the issue becomes whether the Quran explicitly affirms the New Testament canon or simply a general concept of the gospel. Relies on modern scholarship to contextualize the Quran and early Christian history. Provides a coherent alternative explanation for the Quranic Injil. Fails to address Sam's direct Quranic citations affirming previous scriptures. Reliance on scholarship without addressing its limitations weakens their argument in a theological debate. Strong use of Quranic text and internal consistency to frame the Islamic dilemma. Effective critique of the selective use of lookouts. Could engage more with the Muslim speaker's historical claims regarding early Jewish Christians and their practices. Both debaters present compelling arguments, but the effectiveness of their cases largely depends on the audience's presuppositions. Sam's argument appeals to traditionalist Muslims and Christians who accept the Quran as internally consistent, while the Muslim speaker's reliance on modern scholarship resonates with those who prioritize historical critical methodologies. The debate ultimately underscores the challenge of reconciling historical, theological, and scriptural interpretations across different worldviews. Thank you for joining us for this powerful and intense debate. Over the past 10 minutes, Sam Shamoun has presented a relentless critique of Islamic theology, challenging key aspects of the Quran and Islamic beliefs. We've seen Sam's arguments put forward with clarity and conviction, while Muslim Man's Name defended the traditional Islamic perspective. Debates like this reveal just how deep and profound the theological divides are between Christianity and Islam, and how much there is to explore and understand. Whether or not you agree with the positions presented today, we hope you found the discussion thought-provoking and insightful. We thank both Sam and Muslim Man's Name for their time, passion, and commitment to discussing these important issues with respect and intellectual rigor. To everyone watching, we encourage you to continue seeking knowledge, engage in respectful dialogue, and always be open to learning more. Stay tuned for more debates, and until next time, may you be blessed with wisdom and understanding.